The city moved too fast to notice what it trampled. Smiles, dreams, the quiet cries for help. Somewhere in the blur of honking horns and blurred storefronts, a man walked like he had nowhere to be, because truthfully, he didn't. David had stopped chasing purpose months ago. His worn-out jacket hung on his shoulders like a memory, and his eyes, tired and hollow, scanned the sidewalk like he might find a reason to care between the cracks. No one made eye contact. He blended in the way wallpaper does, always there, never noticed. David used to have a rhythm, a job at an ad agency downtown, a wife who made the best Saturday morning pancakes, friends he could call for a beer or a hike. But things had unraveled. Layoffs came fast, the marriage fell apart quietly, and the phone stopped buzzing. He didn't even remember when he stopped trying. Most days now, he just walked, through alleys, under bridges, across coffee shop windows, where people laughed and lived lives that didn't look anything like his. He was like a sentence someone forgot to finish, just hanging there, waiting for a period that never came. One overcast afternoon, David found himself in a small park, just off 7th Avenue, where the trees leaned like they were tired too. On a bench layered with autumn leaves, an old homeless man sat, his clothes ragged but eyes unusually sharp. David slowed as their eyes met. The man looked right at him, not past him, not through him, at him. He gripped a battered baseball, cap in his hands, and before David could pass, the man said, "You've been carrying too much, man." David froze. He hadn't spoken a word. The guy couldn't have known. But somehow that sentence cut deeper than anything anyone had said in years. David turned to ask him, "What did you mean by that? How did you know?" But the bench was empty. No sign of the man, just leaves twisting in the wind like he'd never existed. David looked around, half laughing in disbelief, half shaken. Maybe he was going nuts. Maybe it was just some weird daydream. Still, as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling, that strange, quiet certainty that something had shifted, like someone, or something, had pressed pause on his unraveling just long enough to say, "I see you." That night, the city felt different, not louder or brighter, just more aware. Streetlights flickered as he passed. A song on a passing car radio played the exact words he'd been thinking. He wasn't a believer, hadn't been since college, but some small voice inside him whispered, "You're not alone anymore." He didn't know what was coming next. He didn't know why someone would be watching over a guy like him. But whatever this was, it had just begun. The next morning, David woke up earlier than usual. Not because of an alarm, he hadn't set one in months, but because of a feeling. That same quiet pull he'd felt yesterday was still there, like someone gently tapping on the inside of his chest. He skipped coffee and headed straight out, feet moving with a strange sense of purpose. He didn't know where he was going, but somehow he ended up back at that same small park off 7th. The bench was there, the leaves still covered the ground, but the old man, the one who had vanished without a trace, was nowhere in sight. He sat down anyway. Maybe he was looking for proof he hadn't imagined it. Maybe he just needed to feel close to something that had finally noticed him. Around him, joggers passed by, a dog barked in the distance, a kid threw breadcrumbs at uninterested pigeons. Life was happening loud and ordinary, but David felt like he was sitting outside of it, behind some invisible glass. He stared at the bench across from him. Nothing. But just as he was about to leave, someone sat down next to him. A young man, maybe in his early 20s, wearing jeans, a hoodie, and earbuds he clearly wasn't using. The kid didn't say anything at first, but then, in a low, steady voice, he asked, "Do you believe in second chances?" David blinked. He hadn't expected anyone to speak to him, much less start with that. "Excuse me?" he said, unsure if he'd misheard. The kid repeated it, this time looking directly at him. "Second chances. You think people really get 'em?" David wanted to laugh, maybe say something sarcastic, But instead, what came out surprised him. "I don't know. I used to think so." The kid nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. Then he stood, stretched, and without another word walked away. David watched him disappear down the street, blending into the crowd like everyone else. Another strange encounter. Another person who seemed to know just enough to stir something inside him. What was going on? Was this just the universe messing with him, or something bigger? That night, David couldn't sleep. He thought about the old man, the boy on the bench, the flickering lights, the feeling that someone, or something, was keeping pace with him just outside his line of sight. There was a pattern forming, and he could feel it tightening like a thread pulling through fabric. The next day, he returned to the park again, not hoping, not expecting, just waiting. And this time, the bench wasn't empty. A man in a long, dark coat was sitting there, legs crossed, fedora tilted just enough to shade his eyes. He wasn't old or young, just timeless. David's stomach turned. Something in him recognized this figure, though he was sure they'd never met. The man looked up and smiled, like he'd been waiting for David all along. "You've been looking for answers," he said calmly. "Let's start with the right questions." And just like that, the wind picked up, carrying the story into something far deeper than David could have imagined. The following days blurred into one another, yet the memory of the man in the fedora sat like a stone in David's chest. "Let's start with the right questions," he had said, but then vanished before David could say anything. No name, no explanation, no further words. Just that knowing smile, like a teacher waiting for a student to realize the lesson on their own. David began noticing even more patterns, numbers repeating on receipts, the same dog crossing his path 3 days in a row, a woman on the subway crying the same way his mother had the night she left. The world felt like it was whispering secrets, and he was just beginning to understand the language. Then came the night everything changed. It was just after 2 a.m. when David left the corner store, cradling a coffee he didn't really want. The streets were quiet, except for the occasional hiss of traffic lights changing for no one. He started across the intersection near Lexington and 12th when a blinding light flashed to his left. A car, fast, too fast, barreled toward him, its tires screeching against the rain-slick pavement. There was no time to move, no time to think. Just the dull realization that this was how it ended, on a cold Tuesday morning, in the middle of nowhere, holding a cup of bad coffee. But it didn't end. Everything froze. The raindrops hung in the air like pearls on invisible strings. The light from the car's headlights stopped mid-beam, frozen like a photograph. The screech of tires was still there, but stretched, like a low hum trapped underwater. David was standing, alive, heart pounding, and untouched. Slowly, he turned his head. Standing inches away was the man in the fedora, this time closer. This time, real. He reached out and gently placed 2 fingers on David's chest, not hard, just enough. A warmth spread through him, not physical but something more, like sunlight sinking into his bones. "I told you," the man said, voice steady, almost kind. "Right questions, remember?" David opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked around. Time was still frozen. A pigeon mid-flap hovered in the air. A streetlight flickered without motion. "You're not crazy," the man added, almost amused. "You're seen." Then he turned, stepped back, and the world roared back to life. The car passed through the intersection a second too late, missing David by inches. Coffee spilled, his hands shook, and the world moved again. But David stood there, completely, still, with a single thought blazing in his mind. Who or what was that man? And more importantly, why was he protecting him? After the night, the world stopped turning. Even if just for a moment, David couldn't go back to pretending things were normal. Something had cracked open inside him, and now everything felt brighter and heavier at once. He had questions. Too many. and not a single answer. Who was the man in the coat? Why him? Why now? He needed clarity. So he did what desperate people do. He went looking for the past. There was only one place that ever made sense when life spiraled: St. Jude's Medical Center, where his mother had spent the last months of her life, where, for a brief flicker of time, David had known how to love without conditions. He hadn't set foot in that building in nearly a decade. It still smelled the same, antiseptic and memory. As he walked the long hallway toward the hospice wing, nurses passed by without noticing him, and for a second, he felt like a ghost drifting through a former life. Room 304 was still there. Same number, same dull green door. He hesitated before knocking, unsure what he expected. When no one answered, he turned the handle, unlocked. Inside, the room was empty. No patient. Just a single chair by the window, and a small table with a vase of withered flowers. But the moment he stepped inside, the air shifted. It was warm. Not the forced heat of old radiators, but something softer, like the room itself was holding its breath. David walked to the window, the same one he used to stare out of while his mother slept. Downtown was visible in the distance, lights flickering like distant stars. And then, in the reflection of the glass, he saw him, the man in the coat, standing behind him. David spun around. Nothing, no one, but the air still buzzed with presence. A folded piece of paper sat on the chair, one David swore hadn't been there before. With trembling hands, he opened it. It wasn't a message. It was a sketch, a child's drawing in crayon. Stick figures, a boy holding hands with a tall man wearing a fedora. Both were smiling. Behind them, an angel with wings outstretched stood watch. David's breath caught in his throat. He remembered this drawing. He'd made it when he was 6, after a car accident that should have killed him but didn't. His mom kept it in a shoebox. He hadn't seen it in years. How had it ended up here? And why now? As he stared at the drawing, a voice echoed in his head, not spoken, but felt. You've been watched over longer than you think. His knees buckled, and he sat in the chair, hand still gripping the crayon drawing like it might vanish. He wasn't just being noticed. He had always been known. Room 304 wasn't just a place from his past. It was a window, not just to the city, but to something beyond it. Something watching, something waiting. And for the first time, David wasn't sure if he should be afraid or grateful. The wind picked up the next morning, rushing through the alleys of the city with a strange urgency, not cold, not harsh, but purposeful. David stood by his apartment window, watching the branches outside sway like they were whispering something he wasn't meant to fully hear. He hadn't slept much. The drawing from room 304 now sat on his nightstand, guarded like a secret too precious to explain. He kept staring at it, hoping the crayon lines would reveal something more. Every part of him buzzed with questions, but one had started to echo louder than the rest. Who is he? That afternoon, David found himself wandering again. Not lost. This time, but pulled, like his feet knew something his brain hadn't caught up with. The city's noise felt muted, almost respectful. When he reached the top of Rosewood Hill, a place he hadn't visited since childhood, the breeze shifted. It wasn't just the scent of pine and distant smoke that stopped him. It was the voice, not loud, not even spoken aloud, just a whisper carried by the wind. You used to call me Eli. David's breath hitched, his knees buckled slightly. That name, Eli, crashed into him like a wave breaking on rock. He remembered now, bare feet in summer grass, a boy with skinned knees and too much imagination. Back then, he used to talk, to someone no one else could see. A guardian he'd named Eli. His mom had smiled at first, said it was cute, until the night David said Eli told him not to follow his dad into the car. Hours later, a drunk driver ran a red light. Only one person survived. After that, no one mentioned Eli again, not even David. The grief buried everything. But standing there now, wind dancing around him like invisible arms, it all came rushing back. Eli wasn't imaginary. He never had been. David whispered the name like it was fragile. Eli? And this time, there was no flash of light, no dramatic appearance. Just a quiet shift in the air, and a voice, clear, gentle, achingly familiar. You were never alone. David turned slowly. There, sitting on the wooden bench carved with initials from decades past, was the man in the fedora. No coat this time, just jeans, a hoodie, and eyes that held more history than any lifetime should. He looked young, ageless, like someone who'd been 25 forever. I made you a promise, Eli said softly, and I'm here to keep it. David sat down. Next to him, not afraid, not anymore. Why now? He asked, barely above a whisper. Eli didn't answer right away. He looked out at the horizon where the city met the sky. Because you're ready to remember, he finally said, and because the part of your story that matters most is just beginning. The wind swirled again, warm and steady, and for the first time in years, David felt like he had a name to hold on to, not just Eli's, but his own. He wasn't a ghost in his own life. He was someone seen, someone guarded, someone chosen. It started with the sound of rain, not just falling, but weeping, as if the sky had decided to grieve with him. David sat alone in his apartment, the world outside his window blurred by water and memory. Since that encounter on Rosewood Hill, he hadn't seen Eli again, but he felt him, in the wind, in the stillness between heartbeats, in the way the city's noise softened when he needed peace. And yet inside David, something remained heavy, like a room locked inside his soul that no angel could open. Not without his help. The guilt came first. It crawled in like fog, curling around memories long buried. The day his mother died, he hadn't been there. He'd stayed away, avoiding hospitals, pain, the finality of goodbye. He told himself it was for the best, that she wouldn't have wanted him to see her like that. But in truth, he had been afraid of what it would do to him, of how helpless he felt. And when she passed, so did a part of him, the part that believed he deserved love, the part that knew how to forgive himself. Then came the memory he never spoke aloud, the one he locked away so tightly it had begun to rot. A friend, a rooftop, a moment of hesitation. Don't jump, man. I'm here. That's what David had said. But the boy jumped anyway. And for years, David told himself he'd done all he could, that some people couldn't be saved. But in the dead of night, it wasn't the fall he remembered. It was the silence that followed, the silence that never left. Maybe I wasn't enough, he would think. Maybe I was supposed to save him, and I failed. As the rain poured harder, David broke. He cried for the friend he lost, for the mother he abandoned, for the child who used to believe in angels and second chances. His sobs came in waves, raw and unfiltered, like the pain had been waiting years to escape. The walls of his apartment couldn't hold it in. He collapsed to the floor, hands clutching his chest as if he could physically remove the weight of all he carried. But in the thick of that storm, something shifted. Not outside, inside. Like a string that had been wrapped too tightly, finally snapped loose. Through the blur of tears, he felt a warmth settle over him, not around, but within. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't peace. It was presence. I see it now, David thought. The sadness wasn't because they were gone. It was because I stopped living too. And in that moment of brutal honesty, the silence inside him began to speak. Not in words, but in understanding. His pain didn't disqualify him. It made him human. And maybe, just maybe, that was why Eli had returned, not to erase the sorrow, but to walk him through it. The world didn't look any different, yet somehow everything felt changed. David woke the next morning to a sky washed clean by the storm, the air crisp and still. The weight inside him had shifted, but he wasn't sure what had happened. He wasn't even sure how to explain it. He had cried, yes, but there was something else that lingered, something that felt like a whisper on the edge of his consciousness, urging him to move, to act, to do something with all the grief he'd been carrying for so long. That afternoon, he walked through the city streets, his steps guided by the uneasy feeling that he was about to encounter something he couldn't walk away from. His mind drifted back to the rooftop, the last words he had spoken to his friend. He had never been able to forgive himself for that moment, for the feeling that he could have done more. But what could he do now? It was too late, wasn't it? The rain had washed away his past, but it hadn't fixed it. The idea that he could ever go back and undo the hurt felt impossible. As if in answer to that thought, a boy rode past him on a bicycle, a bright blue bicycle, the kind that seemed out of place in the midst of the gray city. The boy, no older than 12, pedaled with an ease that made it look like he was floating. David stopped and watched, the familiar sense of something unfinished creeping over him again. The boy's face was a blur, but there was something about the way he moved, a grace, a lightness that David couldn't quite place. Then, just as suddenly, the boy braked and turned, pausing at a street corner to adjust his backpack. David's heart skipped. The boy had stopped. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and David froze. The boy's gaze was soft, but there was a familiarity in it that David couldn't shake. And then, without a word, the boy rode off again, disappearing into the crowd. But it wasn't the boy that haunted him as much as the feeling that lingered after he was gone. David's mind raced. He wasn't imagining it. That boy was the same age David had been when he first met his friend. The same age when he had failed to save him. The same age when everything had unraveled. And now, this boy, with his blue bicycle, had appeared in David's path like a second chance. He had seen something in David, just as the boy on the rooftop had. This wasn't about the past. It wasn't even about fixing what had been broken. It was about learning to act, to step forward despite the fear of failure. The blue bicycle was a sign, one that David couldn't ignore. And so, without another thought, he began walking toward the boy. It wasn't just about correcting an old mistake. It was about living differently, about having the courage to be the person he had once believed he could be. He didn't know what would happen if he reached out to this boy, but he knew one thing for sure. This time, he wasn't going to let the chance slip away. The days had passed in a haze. Even though David felt as though he were walking through the motions of life, something within him had fundamentally shifted. His search for meaning, for answers, had turned into something more tangible, a journey, one that took him deeper, into himself than he'd ever gone before. But the weight of everything still lingered, gnawing at him. The past wasn't so easy to outrun, and the mistakes, the pain, the sense of being lost, it all sat with him like an anchor. It felt like he was standing at the edge of a vast, open sea, not knowing whether he should dive in or run the other way. The night came hard, the darkness thick and suffocating. David lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, the sounds of the city muffled outside. The silence in his room was oppressive, like the world was holding its breath. And then, as though the darkness had taken a shape of its own, he heard it. A whisper, soft at first. David. His name, clear and steady, carried on the wind of his thoughts, just like it had when they'd first met. But this time, it wasn't a vague whisper in the back of his mind. It was real. A voice, cutting through the fog of his confusion. It wasn't Eli's usual gentle tone. It was commanding, but tender, like a hand guiding him out of a shadow. "David," the voice said again, as if it were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. He sat up, heart pounding. It wasn't a dream. He was awake. The room felt heavier somehow, like it was pressing in on him. "You've been hiding," the voice continued, now a low murmur, yet it felt as though it was reaching inside him, touching the very core of his being. "You've been running from yourself." David's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced. He had spent so long running, hadn't he? From the pain, from the people he lost, from the guilt that had defined him for so many years, from the part of him that was still a child, still too scared to step forward. But now, here in the stillness of the night, that voice, Eli's voice, wasn't just a reminder, it was an invitation. "You're ready now," Eli said, with a warmth that enveloped David like sunlight. "The choice is yours, David. You've carried this weight long enough. You have everything you need to let it go." David closed his eyes, and for a moment he could almost see it. The light, the warmth that Eli had promised. It wasn't a light that erased everything in its path, but a light that helped him see himself, see the world, see the possibilities. And in that moment of perfect stillness, David realized something that changed everything. The journey hadn't been about fixing the past. It was about living, about opening his heart again to the world, to those he loved, and to the possibility that he could still change. He wasn't broken. He wasn't lost. He was just human. And the most beautiful part of being human was that he could always begin again. David took a deep breath, finally exhaling the tension that had been building for so long. As he closed his eyes and let sleep take him, a soft smile played at the corners of his mouth. The world outside his window had not changed, but he had. And for the first time in years, he felt at peace. The morning was quiet, as if the world were holding its breath. David stood at the old train station, a place that had always been a symbol of passage, of journeys taken, of arrivals and departures. It was a place where people came to leave, to move forward, to start anew. But for David, standing there felt different this time. The station, once a place of fleeting encounters, felt more like a destination, a turning point in his life that he hadn't seen coming. As the morning fog began to lift, there was an undeniable feeling in the air, something both serene and powerful. The trains had long since stopped running to the station, and only a few scattered souls passed by. Yet, David felt as though the station were alive with purpose. There was a hum in the air, a charge of energy that seemed to speak to him. It felt like a moment of finality, a moment where the past, present, and future could collide in a single breath. And then he saw it. At the far end of the platform, bathed in the soft, golden light of dawn, stood a figure, tall but not imposing. At first, it was just a silhouette, but as the light grew, David saw the unmistakable shape of wings, pure, radiant wings, wings that shimmered like sunlight on water, ethereal and luminous. His heart stopped. He knew without a doubt that this was Eli. The man in the fedora, the one who had walked him through his darkest days, was now standing before him in his truest form, an angel. David's breath caught in his throat, and his legs felt weak. He took a hesitant step forward, his heart racing, unsure of what to do or say. The angel didn't move. He simply stood there, waiting, as if he had been waiting for David to come to him all along. Eli? David's voice was barely a whisper, a question and a plea in the same breath. The angel's eyes met his, and David felt as though he were looking into an endless sky, vast, deep, and full of light. There was no answer at first, just a feeling of overwhelming peace that seemed to settle in David's chest. And then Eli spoke, his voice both distant and close, as though it resonated from every corner of the world. "You've done well, David," he said, his tone warm but filled with an undeniable finality. "You've walked through the darkness, and now you are ready to walk in the light." David felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to ask everything, to demand why Eli had appeared, why it had to end this way. But something in the air told him that the answers weren't meant to be spoken. They had already been given, through the years of hardship, through the pain, through the lessons David had learned about himself, about forgiveness, and about the possibility of change. "I've been with you," Eli continued, "longer than you've known, and now your path is your own to walk." There was a pause, and the angel's wings fluttered softly, as if preparing to take flight. "But my time here is done." David's chest tightened. The feeling of loss hit him like a wave, but this time it was different. It wasn't the kind of loss that left a hole in his heart. It was the kind of loss that made room for growth, for new beginnings. The angel was leaving, but David wasn't alone anymore. He never had been. As the first rays of sunlight touched the station, Eli spread his wings and stepped back into the light, and just before he vanished completely, he turned to David, his eyes filled with a deep, quiet understanding. "Remember," he said, and his voice was like a breeze, "you are never truly alone." And then he was gone. The station, once filled with the heavy weight of silence, now felt peaceful. David stood there for a moment, his heart full of gratitude, of love, and of the undeniable truth that everything had changed. The world had never felt so vast, so full of possibilities. For the first time in years, David woke up with a sense of clarity that had eluded him for most of his life. He no longer felt as though he was stumbling through the dark, grasping at fleeting shadows. There was a light now, one that wasn't just outside, but inside him. He had learned the hard way that the path to healing wasn't linear. It didn't follow a neat sequence of steps. It was messy, painful, and often filled with moments of doubt. But each step had brought him closer to something real, closer to understanding the truth that had been waiting for him all along. David stood at the edge of the city, looking out over the skyline as the sun began to set. He didn't need to ask for a sign anymore. He was the sign. The person he had always been searching for had been there all along, not a perfect man, not a flawless being, but a man who had the power to choose to keep going, even when the world seemed too heavy to bear. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it, to accept it, and to move forward in spite of it. The gentle breeze from the horizon ruffled his hair, and for a moment it felt as though the wind was carrying something familiar. It wasn't the wind from the past. It wasn't the weight of old regrets. It was something new, something that felt like the promise of tomorrow. And then, as if by instinct, David turned. He didn't know why he felt so sure, but he knew that he wasn't alone. Not anymore. As he walked toward the park, his heart a little lighter, a little more whole, he saw a figure in the distance, a woman sitting on a bench, reading a book. It wasn't just anyone. It was her. The woman he had met years ago. The one whose smile had been his first reminder that life could still hold beauty, even in the darkest of times. The one he had left behind, lost to the pain he couldn't explain. The one he had never stopped thinking about, even when he convinced himself he had. She looked up, and when their eyes met, a spark of recognition flickered in both of them. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic words, just an understanding, a connection. The years of separation melted away in an instant, and for the first time in a long time, David realized that love had never really left him. It had always been there, waiting for the right moment to bloom again. David walked toward her, and without saying a word, he sat beside her. The air between them was filled with unspoken words, with the understanding that they had both changed, had both lived through their own trials and losses. But they had found each other again, not because they were perfect, but because they had learned to be whole on their own first. And that made all the difference. As they sat in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon, David felt it, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. This was his new beginning. The past had shaped him, but it no longer defined him. The weight of loss, of regret, of fear, all of it had been lifted, not because it was erased, but because he had learned to carry it with grace. And in doing so, he had opened himself up to the future, to the love and connection that awaited him. And in the soft whisper of the evening breeze, David felt a final presence, the warmth of a hand on his shoulder, the familiar weight of an invisible gaze. Eli was gone, but his presence would never fade. It was in every choice David made, in every step he took toward healing. Eli had given him the gift of knowing that no matter where his path led, he would never be truly alone. Not again. With the woman beside him, the city stretching out before him, and the past settling into its rightful place behind him, David smiled. He knew that wherever the road ahead took him, he would walk it with the certainty that he had finally found his way.